Okay, welcome everybody to this next ISEA webinar. We're going to give it two more minutes for everybody to join from wherever they are before we start. Let me see. Hello. Let's see you have. To ask questions. I think there are questions. So, okay. Still see a couple of people running in. Okay, let's slowly start. Welcome, David. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us today and talking about all the research that you do in this interesting field of active learning. Davide
Cacciarelli.
I forgot again. Cacciarelli, I got it, I think, is a postdoctoral fellow at the Imperial College of London. Before this, he worked on research with Murat Kolaci and others in Denmark. And we're very happy that you're joining us today to share your research. Before we dive into that, I wanted to let everybody know that we have 2 new webinars coming up for the rest of the spring. On the 2nd of April, so just in about 4 weeks, we'll have Bianca Colosimo share all her fascinating work in advanced manufacturing. And in May, towards the end of May, we'll have Fidel Megahad from Miami, Ohio, talk about the use of generative AI. So keep an eye on your inbox once those invitations come along. For now, then, David, I'd like to invite you to share with us your research. Let me set that up by making you a presenter.
Yeah.
Right, there we go. Then for all the attendees here today, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. We have 3 different parts of the talk, so we'll have some room for questions after each of the different parts. I'll be monitoring that, so please let us know your questions by putting them in the chat, and then we'll get to them at the end of each of the 3 separate parts. David, the floor is all yours, the digital floor.
Can you see the screen, Ines, everything?
We can.
Okay, amazing. Thank you for the introduction, Ines. And thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I'm really excited to present my research today. So the title of the presentation is going to be Active Learning for Industrial Applications, which is the title of a paper we published on quality engineering a few months ago. The main topic is going to be like how do we train machine learning models with less data. So just to give a little bit of background, as Ines said, I'm currently a research associate at Imperial College London, and I work in the Analytics and Markets lab with Pierre Pensson. Before that, I was doing a PhD at Technical University of Denmark and the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And my thesis was centered on this topic of active learning, which I'm going to talk shortly about. So just want to give you an overview of the works that we've done on during my PhD on this topic. So the first 2 papers are kind of an overview or surveys, if you're interested kind of having a general view on this research topic. The first one on quality engineering is just practical overview with some examples. Then we got a survey more detailed on stream-based active learning on published on machine learning. And then there are other papers more focused on like specific subfield of the area, which I'm going to present in the last part of my presentation. And if you're interested in getting like a PDF or whatever, you can reach out to me. Probably I can share with you the papers if you cannot find them online. So the presentation today is going to be divided into 3 parts. First, we're going to give a broad overview of active learning. Then we're going to focus on pool-based active learning. And then finally, the third part of the presentation is going to be based on stream-based active learning. So I'm just going to give you a first kind of motivation or introduction. So everybody's already heard the famous quote like data is the new oil. But we got some issues or like bottleneck in trying to exploit all this data for training AI model or machine learning models is that most data is unlabeled or it comes in a raw form, which needs to be adjusted or in particular labeled by humans in many cases. And this process of manually labeling data is costly, slow, and often unsustainable. So the quick question that we're trying to tackle today is how can we build better models with less labeled data? So just to give a little bit more formally, just to this problem, when we are performing supervised learning, we're often interested in learning a model, which is a mapping from a domain X to Y, and trying to learn this kind of model with a set of labeled examples. And what we mean when we say it's difficult to get labels is that we often have a problem of label scarcity. That means that obtaining a feature vector, so X, is relatively easy, but getting the corresponding label is challenging. And this makes it difficult to train a machine learning model. In practice, what does it mean? Like, just to give you some examples of why it can be challenging to acquire the label in real life, because we might have some issues like in terms of time, money, or ethical reasons. For example, in computer vision, if we're interested in training a deep neural network, we might have to manually label tons of images to get like a good accuracy of the model. In design optimization, in industrial engineering, we might have to run extensive simulations. In quality control, this might be like performing chemical or physical tests on products, which sometimes also destructive tests. So we might need to have available lots of products or components to inspect and get a real quality measure of the components. In clinical trials, we might have to actually perform medical tests or diagnosis or getting consultation from doctors. So, for example, getting the feature, like information about the patients, it's easy, but getting the actual diagnosis from a doctor can be quite expensive. And also in drug development, we might have to completely develop a drug and test it from scratch, which can be kind of a lengthy and industrious problem. So a potential solution to this problem of label scarcity is active learning, which is a paradigm which is driven by the goal of training a machine learning models using less data. How do we do that? So in the most basic active learning loop is that we have an initial model, we feed it on a small pool of initial data that we have available. Then we use this kind of model to select new observations. We get the labels, we update the training set, and we feed again the new model on the enlarged training set. And it's kind of a loop which is kind of driving us to select new observations to update our model in our training set. So just to give an overview of active learning, which can be generally divided into 3 scenarios. The classification, you can find it in a very nice survey paper by Barsettles, which was published by the technical reports in the University of Wisconsin. And we basically divide active learning into 3 scenarios: membership query synthesis, pool-based active learning, and stream-based active learning. I'm just going to give an overview of these kind of 3 scenarios before we delve into like the query strategies and the rest of the presentation. So the first scenario is the membership query synthesis. Is a case where we have a model, we have some initial data, and we can synthetically generate new observations where we would like to have the label. So for example, in this case, the model is given complete freedom to pick an instance in the input space where we would like to receive a label and use that instance to update the model. A second scenario is, this is most commonly encountered in practice in the literature, is that we have a huge pool of unlabeled data and we need to select some observations, like a subset of it that we want to label. So imagine, like, for example, we have a folder with tons of images, thousands and thousands of images, and we say we only got 1 day to label the images. How do we select the most informative ones to train a model? And the third scenario, which is the most challenging and interesting, especially from a statistical point of view, is kind of we have a stream of data of like instances, and we need to select on the fly observations to be labeled. That we are subject to a budget, so we cannot select all the observations, but we need to immediately decide after we observe each image or each observation whether we want the label or not. So in each of these 3 scenarios, we might wonder, how do we decide whether a data point or an instance is worth being labeled? So we can use different kind of strategy for that. Most commonly encountered one is like model-based strategy. So we can decide based on our model that we are training, uncertainty-based criteria, or error variance minimization strategy, or if we have a kind of pool or an ensemble of models or of experts, we might want to select to focus on those instances where the different models disagree. Then we got other strategies which are based on feature-based, so they don't directly look at the model performance or model criteria, but they rather focus on diversity or density-based approaches. And this is based on clustering of graph-based methodology, or also distant measures. For example, this is something we commonly do in process control, like getting something which is far from our initial data. And finally, we can also have a hybrid strategy which combines model-based criteria and feature-based criteria. So just want to, given the big audience from ISEA, I just wanted to draw a connection between active learning and DOE, which is in design of experiments, which is something I believe to be very interesting. So wondering, like, is this really something new, something from machine learning? But I just wanted to say this is a very similar problem to design of experiments, which is a sampling problem where we have a domain X, and we need to design the locations whether we want to observe the response to perform an experiment. So we can think of active learning as a modern approach to experimental design, which is specifically tailored for improving a machine learning model while minimizing the need for labeled data. And then I just wanted to touch upon really quickly on experimental optimal designs, but we're gonna cover it in the third part of the presentation. So we're gonna give an overview now of pool-based active learning and some practical examples of how these strategies can be used in practice. So first, I'm gonna show a case where we have a binary classification model. So in this case, you can see in the screen on the plot on the left that we got within a machine learning model, a classification model, in this case a logistic regression model on these two clouds of points for two classes. And now we computed the margin score for all the points on a fine grid of a fine mesh grid. And what we can see, the margin score, which is the difference from the score assigned to being labeled with a class 1 or with a class 0, is very high in the central region of the plot, so where the two cluster data points encounter. So in this case, if we were to decide if we get new observation, want to decide which data point should we label and act to the training set according to an uncertainty-based strategy, we will need to focus on this area where the margin score is the lowest, and it's kind of reflecting the indecision of the model into classifying those data points which are at the border of the two populations. Another example is, for example, in the case of a regression model. So in this case, we may use a Gaussian process regression. This is just a simple example. And we assuming that the training examples there are dots, and then we trying to learn the function which is dashed. And we can see, for example, in this case, if we wanted to collect new observations using an active learning strategy like uncertainty based, where we need to collect new observation. In this case, we will do that where the prediction variance is the highest. So in this coincides with the area where the training examples have not been collected. So in this case, we are being encouraged to explore new areas of the input space. So while before we were trying to explore like uncertain region or like model where like transitional areas, now we are going to be encouraged to explore unexplored regions. Finally, an example from the feature-based criteria is that if we don't want to look at like any specific model performance, model task like regression or classification, we can just apply a feature-based strategy, like for example in this case a clustering algorithm, and then we can try to seek some diversity or representativeness in the samples, in the data points that we're going to collect. So in this case, for example, we divided the data into 4 clusters, and then we applied after applying a PCA algorithm to reduce the dimensionality, and eventually we're going to select, for example, if we have a budget of 20 observations, we selected 5 observations from each cluster, and it's going to give us 20 observations in total, which is kind of satisfy the criteria of being a diverse set, but also representative, because in particular we're going to have observation which is close to the centroid of each cluster, but also belonging to different clusters. So we might kind of equally represent different subpopulations of the input space, but also kind of representative of each of them. Now we're gonna give a short case study, a brief case study using like active learning for defect detection in quality control. So in this case, we can see 4 images. On the left are like you can see images which are like non-defective. The first one on letter A is a bottle, and then we got a metal nut. In this case, the task will be to train 2 machine learning models to detect broken bottles or broken metal nuts. And this can be like a kind of laborious task because we might need to manually label hundreds of images for each kind of product and ask an industrial operator or a manual labeler in general to put a label on each image, like defective or non-defective. And we want to, in this case, we want to minimize the number of labels needed to train accurate machine learning models. So just to give an overview of a simple strategy we can use in this case, we use 3 steps in this pipeline model. First, we use a pre-trained neural networks to reduce the dimensionality of the images. So we get from RGB images to a 1D array of length 412. Then we further reduce the dimensionality of this array using a principal component analysis. So we retain 100 features, which explain 90% of the regional variance. And now eventually we just feed a simple logistic regression algorithm. So these are the steps of the kind of analysis to go from images to a simple array to fill a logistic regression model. And eventually we use an active learning strategy like the margin-based score, the one that we saw in example 1 for the classification, to select the most uncertain images. And you can see in the results that we can obtain near optimal performance at a fraction of the cost. What does it mean in practice? If you see on the x-axis, you can see the percentage of labeled examples that we use. The dashed line in gray is the performance of the model trained on all the images. And you can see, for example, that we get to like 50% of the images. In the first case, like with 40% of the images picked using the active learning, we got the performance of the full model. So it's kind of a huge save in terms of the time spent labeling images. In the second case, we don't reach quite the performance of the full model, but we get very close. We only 60% of the images being labeled. So it kind of shows that even in a kind of complex task like finding defects in images, using active learning with a very simple pipeline, we can have some important advantages. Then just I wanted to quickly touch upon the stopping criteria. So the idea is like, when do we stop collecting labels? Because this process, like, we actually don't know, like, for example, in this case, whether we will get like 50%, 60%, when do we really want to stop the learning process? So in some cases, we have a strict budget. For example, we might have like 3 hours for labeling, or we might have like only a few number of images that we can pay for a labeler to annotate. But in other cases, when we don't have a strict budget, we can use some performance-based stopping criterion. In this case, we can see the true learning curve, which is the solid black line, which is something that we cannot truly observe in real life because we don't have a test set, especially in active learning cases when the labels are very expensive. And we can try to approximate that curve using either the leave one out cross-validation score, which is something maybe you might be very familiar with, and also the stabilization score. So the stabilization is using kind of a validation set and compares the predictions of the most recent pairs of models. So each active learning loop, I have a model, and in each step of the learning process, I compare the predictions that I subsequently obtain using these models on the validation set. And when this prediction starts to be very, very similar, it's like getting new labels is not impacting anymore my learning performance, so I might as well stop the learning process and save in terms of labeling budget. So I just want to, this kind of the end of the part on pool-based active learning, and I'm gonna continue to giving an overview on stream-based active learning. We watched
yes.
the kind of.
I think if you may allow me, I have a couple of questions that that might be nice to discuss now. Yeah. So there's a question on if you could explain a little bit more about the ResNet 18 and how that works.
Yeah. So this kind of ResNet is just a neural network, like a deep neural network, which is in this case we use it like a pre-trained. So it's a deep learning model you can find already pre-trained in many Python libraries, and it's been already trained for on a huge amount of data, like Coco or other big data sets, and it's very useful because it's if you have a task where you need to like kind of extract some features using a deep learning model. You don't want to train a model from scratch. You can pick one of these pre-trained models, and it's gonna extract some interesting features. So this means that if you just have some images, you might get to extract some perform some tasks like getting for example, like from a large dimensional matrix from the original images to a simple lower dimensional representation of the image, which is still meaningful for some tasks that you might perform on top of it. And what you do in practice, you just take the full deep neural network, which has been already trained on these large data sets, and you pick it until the last layer. So you remove the last layer, which is the final classification layer or whatever is the original model was trained for, and then you use it to reduce the dimensionality of your images. Yeah.
And then there's another question that says, in the case study, what type of pool-based active learning did you use? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so basically since we use a simple logistic regression model, we use this strategy here, so the margin-based active learning. So we assume we only have two classes, defective and non-defective. So in this case, for example, class 0 is non-defective, and class 1 is defective. And for each observations so we have an initial model, and for each observation in the unlabeled pool, we compute the margin score. So we compute the difference between the prediction of being defective and being non-defective. The idea, what's the underlying idea behind this process, is that if this difference is very high, the model is very confident about the prediction. Because, for example, if I predict 0.9 being class 1 and 0.1 being class 0, the difference is going to be high, and this means that I'm very confident it's going to be class 1. Whereas where this difference is really small, I'm in a situation where the two predictions for the two classes are very similar, so the difference is very small, and I'm not really confident whether this image is defective or non-defective. So I want to focus on those images where the predictions for the score for the two classes is kind of close. Yeah.
Maybe a quick follow-up question for myself. How computationally intensive is that to do that grid and to obtain those sort of scores to understand which images you should sample?
It's very fast because it's only like the inference time of in this case a simple logistic regression model. So I'm just predicting. I'm not training anymore now. I'm just predicting, for example, 100,000 observations and compute this difference. So it's very fast.
Yeah.
To this side. Yeah.
And then there is another question related to the ResNet, whether you do some pre-processing of the images before you do ResNet feature extraction.
In this case, the images were already pre-processed, I think. So the dataset, let me show where you can find it. You can find it from the MVTech dataset. There are a couple of papers on this dataset, which are explaining all the details. It's from the AI for Industries conference, IEEE. So I can share the paper at the end of the presentation if you're interested in the images or the details.
Okay. Then maybe before we continue with the third part, one more question.
Yep.
What are the number of labeled samples are added every iteration in the active learning? And
So,
so what's the pool of labeled samples that you add every iteration? Is it a pool or maybe one? And what are you doing in that retraining of the model?
So this kind of a strategy is kind of a trade-off between computational time and how optimal do you want to be in your sampling. So in this case, we used only one observation at this time. So this kind of a drawback of being not maybe the most computationally efficient strategy, but on the other side, it's very efficient in the number of observations that I pick. Because if I pick the most uncertain observation, when I add it to the model, then I get an updated view on the model and I can select the new one. Whereas if I select more than one observation at each time, I can be more efficient because I don't need too many retrainings or updates of the model, but I can have some maybe redundant information, because maybe after getting one observation in a specific area of the input space, I get an updated view, and I didn't, in hindsight, I will find out that I didn't need as many as I thought in that area, because maybe one was enough to understand or to improve the model. And if I maybe were to select 5 or 10 using the previous model, I was about to select all of those in the same regions. So it is kind of a trade-off choice, which I think it's mostly depend like on the computational versus like sampling efficiency that we want to obtain.
Yeah, great. Well, I hope that answers all of your questions. Please keep the questions coming, but let's have a look at your next part of your talk first. But feel free to upload your questions in the chat for everybody in the audience.
Thank you, everybody, for the questions. I'll go on to the third part of the presentation, which is focusing on stream-based active learning. So it's the scenario where we have a stream of data points that we want to select on the fly observations, whether we want to label or we want to discard them. So this kind of, just to give an overview, this is very similar to a statistical riddle, which is called the secretary problem. So it's a scenario where we are interested in hiring a new person, and we have different people presenting for the interview. And after each interview, I need to decide, do I want to hire this person or just want to move on to the next candidate? And it's kind of the main challenge lies in the fact that we cannot see all the candidates and then decide who do we want to hire, but we need to decide immediately after each interview whether we want to hire the person or we just want to, we want to see the next one, the next one. And it's kind of the very same problem, or with the data points coming one after another, and decide whether we want to label them or whether we want to discard them. So just a few examples of why this might be relevant in real life. For example, in industrial processes, we might have pieces or components which are coming down from stations, and if we don't select the image, the component in the very moment, it might go into like a work in progress stations, or may get some transformation when at that point we're not able to collect the label anymore. So we need to select in that specific moment the component for the inspection, the label collection, or that component is going to be lost for good. In clinical trials, we might have some situations where we've got volunteers coming up to test a drug, and we need to decide in the very moment whether we want to include that person in the study, or we just say, okay, now we're going to wait until another person, maybe somebody older, shows up and volunteers to test a drug. And also in online ads, for example, if we are clicking on a video or opening a YouTube video, and we might want to offer, like, for example, a beta version of a software, of an app, only to a certain amount of people, but we only deciding that person, if somebody is opening up a video, so we're going to decide, do we want to offer this user with these characteristics the beta version, or we want to offer it to another one. And first part of this section is going to be focused on linear regression models, so not quite as focused on images like before, mostly on simple regression model. And here we draw the connection with the design of experiment and the optimality criteria. So in this case, we assume we want to train a linear regression model, and this strategy that we proposed in this paper, which has been published in Knowledge-Based Systems, is called Stream-Based Active Learning with Linear Models. It uses a strategy which is called conditional optimality. So this strategy basically trying to select data points which maximize the scale prediction variance of the current model. So the key idea is that we have an initial design, so we have key observations which are already collected and used to train an initial model, and then we have an active learning step, like in the previous cases where we compute the scalar prediction variance for the new observation and decide whether we want to collect this observation or not. So the idea is that the new observation will make the design optimal, conditional on the observation that we have already collected. And this kind of, there is the nice point here is the connection between a scale prediction variance and the optimality. And the main issue is how do we update or adapt this strategy for dealing with streaming data. And what we did was very similar to a statistical process control approach. So we try to determine a threshold, upper control limit on the scale prediction variance of the coming observation, and then we just fix that based on a sampling rate or a labeling rate, if you wish. So the overall algorithm is composed of 3 main stages. We have an initialization phase where we initialize the model by labeling k observations at random. Then we have a warm-up phase, like in phase 1 in SPC, for example, where we have this model and we compute the scalar prediction variance on a few observations without sampling. This is just going to give us an idea of the distribution of the scalar prediction variance. It's going to allow us to determine a threshold. And then based on the threshold, this kind of phase 2 in SPC, we collect and label the observations with a scalar prediction variance exceed this upper control limit. So you can see here some simulations and some testing on the Tennessee S1 process where the proposed approach offers significant improvements. So in this case, the learning curves are slightly different from the second example, from the case study on defect detection. But basically, the red dashed line is random, and what we highlighted here is the percentage difference of the root mean square error performance of the proposed method. So what you can see is that using the proposed approach, considering this a very simple regression model, after like 5 or 10 learning steps, we can get an improvement up to 20% compared to random sampling. And this performance gain degrades over number of observations because, for example, being a very simple model, after already 50 learning steps, the performance get closer to whatever we would obtain using random sampling. Then I wanted to also introduce another problem which is very interesting for streaming data, which is one of concept drift. So just trying to motivate, there are some cases where models can become obsolete, and in particular, just to give an introduction, we have different kind of shift or drift that can affect the data generating process. So the covariance shift is also called virtual drift, is what we often tackle in SPC. So trying to understand when there is a step change in a process, for example, or the distribution of my covariance is changing. A label shift is only a shift that affects the distribution of my labels of the response, and is, for example, trying to model or predict a flu, which is more frequent during the winter than during the summer. So we got different distributions based on the time of year. And the third one, which is the most difficult, is concept drift, because the conditional distribution of the response given the covariance changes. And this sometimes determined by, like, for example, hidden effects that affect the relationship between the input feature or macroeconomic phenomenon that can affect the an economic model or distribution of the preferences of consumers changes over time. For example, during COVID time, the preferences of user for home delivery were much higher, of course, for external constraint than during previous years. And the main issue of concept drift is that it can only be detected if we know the label of the observations. So we can only understand if the underlying model is changing by collecting the labels. And it's just showing, for example, showing the learning curve of active learning algorithm with when we have a phenomenon of concept drift. So we can see that initially our error is reducing because we are improving and collecting new labels, and we are improving our understanding of the model. Then we got, for example, sudden jump in the error because the underlying model has changed. So there's a new concept that's being introduced because, for example, the coefficients of the model have changed. Then once again, I'm trying to collect new labels, so the model is trying to improve and learning the new concept. But whenever a new concept or a new coefficient is changed by external or hidden factors, the error goes up again. And eventually, if I were to end up to consume my old labeling budget, the error was never going to reduce again. So the residuals became high. Then this is a very prolific area of research. It was just a couple of slides to give an overview, because this might be very relevant when we have research on streaming data or stream-based active learning. And this is just a very simplistic scenario representation of the issue. Then we got the final part of the presentation of stream-based active learning, where we once again focused on knowledge distillation, on the computer vision, sorry, and in particular on the concept of knowledge distillation. So in this case, we have a case where we use a larger model instead of a human annotator. So knowledge distillation, in more general, is a technique where we use a teacher model, which is kind of large general purpose model, to specialize or to train a smaller model, which is referred as the student. So in this case, for example, we get training data or images, we get the prediction of the teacher, and using the prediction of the teacher, we train the student. So the student is trained using as input the images, the original images, and using as label the prediction made by the teacher. And this can be beneficial for several reasons. But for example, in particular, one of the reasons why this technique is used is model compression. And what do we mean by model compression is that we might want to have a model which is much smaller in terms of parameters than the original model, but still close in performance. So by training a smaller model using the prediction of a larger model, we can have the final model to mimic the original performance and get very close to the teacher performances, but only with a smaller number of parameters. And in particular, if we were to combine this concept of knowledge distillation with active learning, we can have the strategy which is called active distillation. So in this case, the idea is that we want to specialize a student model using the labels from a teacher model, but only we want to select a certain amount of features to specialize the student. You might wonder why do you want to use active learning in this context if you're not having a human annotator? But the idea is that even if we are not using a human annotator, getting the prediction from a large model can still be expensive. For example, if we have a larger model which is running on a AWS server, or if we pay a token for each prediction, we still want to minimize the number of predictions or inference time of the large model, and only get, for example, the predictions for a smaller subset of observations. In particular, the case study where we applied this problem, which I need to thank Dany Manja from Université Catholique de Leuven for his work on this topic and for including him in the project, is that we wanted to specialize an object detection model for each of the 12 cameras that you see here on the screen. So the idea is that you want to have a specialized model for each camera, because the inclination and the placement of the camera can make the pattern recognition task very different. And so we might have better performances if we have a specialized model for each camera. And the idea is that we fine-tune the smaller models or student models for each camera using the prediction of a larger model. And the motivation here for using the model compression comes from the fact that the specific requirements of the system where the models were running made it necessary for the model to be as light as possible. So not having a huge model which takes a lot of memory to run, or any other constraints from a strict computer science perspective. In this case, you can see the comparison of different performance active distillation strategies. How do we select the number of observations to get a prediction from a teacher and then eventually fine-tune a student model. And in this case, you can see that the most performing strategy is the top confidence one. The red line is the performance of the teacher, and the black line is the performance of the student without collecting new labels. So you can see that only with 250 images, we can get close to the performance of the teacher model using a much smaller student model. And the interesting insight from this experiment is that while initially in the presentation I showed that in active learning we generally want to focus on the uncertain images or where the margin is high or where the predictive variance is very high, when we use in this case knowledge distillation, this is quite the opposite. We want to focus on the top confident images. And why is that? The reason is that I want to focus on the most uncertain images or on the data points with high margin whenever I know that the label I'm going to collect is a true one, is actually a representative of the real quality measure or label. But in this case, since we are dealing with a teacher annotator and not a human, it's not a perfect oracle. So if I'm going to ask observations where my student model is very uncertain, the teacher model, which is not a human, might provide a wrong label, and this wrong label can actually degrade the performance of the model. So in this case, where we are not dealing with a perfect oracle or a perfect annotator, we may get better performances if we ask the model to only label like images or data points where I already have a fairly high confidence, because I'm gonna get good labels, and good labels are gonna lead to better performances. And this closes the part on the stream-based active learning. I know it's been a little of a mixed topic. I hope you got something interesting out of it. And just to give a summary of this presentation on active learning, we propose active learning as a powerful framework for addressing label scarcity in machine learning. We first gave an overview of scenarios and applications, then give some simple examples on how active learning can be used in regression and classification problems. Also provide some example on stream-based active learning for linear regression, introduced concept drift in active learning, and also just quickly touched upon how knowledge distillation can be used to improve scalability for computer vision tasks. Yeah, I want to thank you all for your attention, for joining the webinar. Also, thank you, Ines, for inviting me, and I will be open for questions if you have any curiosity about this remaining part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, David. I have a question from Bart de Ketelaar from Leuven. He's asking, one, if the slides will be available. So yes, we typically put the slides on our ISEA websites, but I'm sure you can also send David an email and ask for them.
Yeah, totally.
Right? But we put them on our website as well. And he's asking, in the knowledge distillation, do you pass predictions generated by the teacher model to student model, or learn features from the teacher model?
So sorry, can you repeat the question, Ines?
In the knowledge distillation, do you pass predictions generated by the teacher model to the student model?
Yes. Yeah. So the idea is that we have, for example, these original images. We get the prediction from the teacher. So we got the location of in this case, the location of the boxes where was detecting the objects, and then we were using the original images and in this location of the boxes given by the teacher to specialize the student models. So we only used hard label images, like for example annotated by us for measuring the test error and having the learning curves, but the models were trained using the labels obtained by the teacher model.
So in general, for this active learning, do you see that this field will be I don't know, influenced or pushed forward with more use of the sort of generative models that can do labeling for you instead of doing human labeling?
Well, I think this is generally something that's going to be very interesting for the like in terms of also self-supervision and generative model is going to be very impactful in this field. Like when I did most of my research, I was not focusing on generative model or large language models, but I think this can be, especially for like complex tasks, is going to be something very impactful. For simpler cases where we have, for example, regression models or smaller models or industrial cases, I don't think it's going to be a major fact, because, for example, if you wanna train a regression model for soft sensors or for anomaly detection in very specific industrial processes or smaller cases, I don't think like generative models gonna provide much of an advantage. But in larger problems, they may certainly be the case.
Yeah, they might be provided cheap, less accurate label somehow. Right? Yeah. Another question coming in from Elif Konyar, saying, thank you for the great presentation. In knowledge distillation, do you transfer knowledge from other student models? And in which cases is that possible?
So in this case, we only transfer knowledge from the teacher to the student. So we only train each student individually. But we have an extension of the paper with, I must be honest, I didn't contribute as much as the other authors, but it's currently being under revision, when the main idea was to, instead of having one specialized model for each camera, can we try to optimize the research and have collaborative models? So in a sense, where we are still training students only using one teacher, but we are using the same student for images for cameras which are very similar. For example, you can see here camera 1 and camera 3. It may prove advantages to use the same model for these two cases, because they represent a very similar scene. So in the paper is on archive. You can find it on my Scholar. I can send it to you. And the idea is there is kind of a sweet spot between specialization for each camera and also grouping together cameras with similar characteristics, but still training only like one model for using only the teacher labels. Yeah.
Great. I was a personal question for me, a little bit back to the second part where you showed that you needed about 40% less images for training the same model or getting the similar performance, right? I was just wondering how 40% of how many images? I mean, is that still a lot of images, 40%, or is that what's the total sort of ballpark figure?
In this case, I think we were on the matter of 500 images in total. I don't wanna say something wrong. I need to double check the MTV Tech dataset, but I think the total pool was around 500 images for each.
That's a lot of images you don't have to label 250 or something. Yeah. Then I have another question coming in from Hassani. Sorry for not pronouncing your name properly. Thank you, David, for the great presentation. I have a general question. How would active learning mitigate the challenges of imbalanced data sets? Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting topic. If I'm being honest, majority of my PhD was focused either on regression problems. So that's not a topic that I study on myself, but there are many interesting papers on active learning with specifically for class imbalance. And yeah, so the most obvious would be like to try to favor images where I kind of or observations that I think might belong to the minority class, but that's not a topic that I strictly focus on myself. So I don't really want to say something, but I would encourage. There are many papers about it, and but it's not a topic I really focused on myself.
Fair enough. We can't know everything.
I cannot give a more comprehensive answer. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I think, well, if there's any last minute questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. Otherwise, David, thank you very much for a very engaging talk.
Thanks to you for inviting me, and thanks to everybody for joining and be so proactive in the presentation.
And for our audience, we will be sharing the slides and the recording on our website, so you can find it there. And we hope to see you again in about a month with Bianca Colosimo, and in 2 months with Fidel. I have a couple of thank yous coming in as well, David. So I think everybody enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody. Bye.
Let me see, then I will stop the webinar now. See you. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Ines. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.